1 Samuel chapters 30 through 31. David and his men arrived in Ziklag on the third day. The Amalekites had raided the Negev and attacked and burned Ziklag. They also had kidnapped the women and everyone in it, from youngest to oldest. They had killed no one, but had carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men arrived at the town, they found it burned. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been kidnapped. David and the troops with him wept loudly until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives, Ahinoam and the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, had also been kidnapped. David was in an extremely difficult position because the troops talked about stoning him, for they were all very bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God, just as we should do, guys. David got back to his home and found out that all of his people, even his wives, were kidnapped. So everybody, the size of that storm just got everybody's eyes off of the Lord. And they started focusing on the pain and on the hurt and on the loss, thinking the worst. That everybody was dead, that they took all of their wives. Who knows the thoughts that passed through their minds that they were going to do to their daughters and their wives and their children and their families. Who knows how bad those thoughts were. But what does Jesus say? What did Jesus tell Peter when he stepped off of the boat? Keep your eyes fixed on me. Because when Peter started focusing on the storm, he started to fall into the water and started to sink. The devil will bring many storms, but we have to keep our eyes fixed on the Lord and turn to him every single time. No matter how big, how impossible that storm may look. No matter how big that Goliath, that storm may be at that moment is. David was in an extremely difficult position because the troops talked about stoning him, for they were all very bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. David said to the priest Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought it to him. And David asked the Lord, "Should I pursue these raiders? Will I overtake them?" The Lord replied to him, "Pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue the people." Now look what David did. The same as we are to pray about everything. Before David went in pursuit to catch these people, what did he do? He went into prayer. He called out on the Lord and asked the Lord, should he go on pursuit and chase these people down? And what did the Lord tell him? The Lord replied to him, the Lord replied to him, "Pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue the people." See the difference? David, first he got hit and he started crying and getting sad just like the rest of them. But then what did he do? He got his eyes back on focus and he turned right to the Lord. So David and the 600 men with him went. They came to the Wadi Besor, where some stayed behind. David and 400 of the men continued the pursuit, while 200 stopped because they were too exhausted to cross the Wadi Besor. David's men found Egypt. David's men found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. So pay attention to what happened to David's people. Once they got to this water, some of the men were too tired to fight because the devil will sometimes bring little battles as distractions so that we get our focus on these little battles and wear ourselves out and drag ourselves down and keep ourselves worn out, to keep us from focusing on the real battle that is at hand, the one that is to come, so at the time that battle comes, we can't cross that river because we're too worn out, too beat up from all of our crying, from all of our worrying, from all of our crying out, from all of our battling and trying to fight it the best way we know how, instead of just trusting in the Lord. David's men found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. Then they gave him some pressed figs and 2 clusters of raisins. After he ate, he revived, for he hadn't eaten food or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. Then David said to him, "Who do you belong to? Where are you from?" "I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite man," he said. "My master abandoned me when I got sick 3 days ago. He raided the south country of the Cherethites, the territory of Judah, and the south country of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag." So now God delivered into David's hands the one man, or a man, that came from the army that actually took David's people. There's 2 things that stand out to me there. One of them is, since this man got sick, he was more of a burden to his master, so his master abandoned him. That's almost like the Christians, right? Or the not only Christians, but regular people, right? That once you start becoming a burden to them, once they start not liking the things that you're saying, once you're not so agreeing with them on every little thing, but you differ with them on certain things, a lot of people like to get upset and abandon you, just like this guy's master did. But what did David do? The real man of God. He came, he took this man in. This man who was an Egyptian, this man who was a slave of the man that just stole his family. And what did David do? He fed this man and brought him back to life, built him up, the same way that Jesus says we are to love our neighbors. There's a parable that Jesus told about who are our neighbors. Because they ask out of pride, who is our neighbors? So Jesus goes on to tell them a story, a parable of a man that was wandering down a dark road. And then these other men came out and robbed him and beat him and left him for dead laying there. And these holy men, these priests, walked right by him. Didn't even turn an eye. They kept going. But then this other man that was unclean to these people, this man acted more like a child of God than the own children of God. This unclean man, what did he do? He helped this man get up, get cleaned up. He took him to a hotel. He paid for him to get fixed up and helped. He paid for a room for him. And he gave the owner of the hotel extra money so that he could continue on his road trip. So that anything that this man needed was already paid for. And so that this man could continue to take care of this guy that was dying. Even though this man that did this good deed never even knew this man. Which of us knows how to love our neighbor that way? None of us do. We love ourselves that way. We always look out for what's best for us. But when do we look out for our neighbors in that sense? Don't be like that man that abandoned somebody, right? Because they became a burden. Sometimes the Lord will bring people into our paths to reprove us on certain things. If we get offended, if we get hurt by that, rather than holding on to that conviction and running with it because it is a cure to refine us, to put us through the fire so that we could be perfected in God's image, do not turn away or abandon ship just because of a disagreement. Don't allow your pride to speak up so loud that you end up turning away from a brother or sister, or hating a brother or sister and forsaking that brother or sister just because you disagree with something that they do or say. We are not better than anybody, lest we are caught up with a spirit of self-righteousness. It is not by our own righteousness, by our own holiness, that we are getting saved. So why would we think ourselves higher or knowing more or better than anybody to be able to forsake them because they don't do it the way we do it? We are nobody. Aside from Jesus Christ, all of us would have the same fate and we would all end up in hell. It is His righteousness, His finished work on the cross that brings healing over us and protects us and transforms us and does its work inside of us. David then asked him, "Will you lead me to these raiders?" He said, "Swear to me by God that you won't kill me or turn me over to my master, and I will lead you to them." So he led him. And there were the Amalekites spread out over the entire area, eating, drinking, and celebrating because of the great amount of plunder they had taken from the land of the Philistines and the land of Judah. David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day. None of them escaped except 400 young men who got on camels and fled. David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. He also rescued his 2 wives. Nothing of theirs was missing, from the youngest to the oldest, including the sons and daughters. And all the plunder the Amalekites had taken, David got everything back. He took all the flocks and herds which were driven ahead of the other livestock, and the people shouted, "This is David's plunder." So not only when David turned to the Lord did God give him the victory and keep his people safe that got taken and kidnapped, right? But David not only got them back just like the Lord said he would, but on top of that, he got even more on top of it. Because he also got all of the livestock. Who knows how much livestock these people got from the other cities that they had destroyed before. David now inherited all this plunder because he kept his eyes on the Lord. He didn't get caught up in the battle. A lot of us will miss out on a lot of things and of walking fully in the Spirit because we get caught up on the other battles and we allow it to become a distraction and we allow it to speak louder than what our purpose is here on this earth. To live is Christ. Our purpose here is to be the light in the midst of the darkness. When people see you, so that they could see Christ in you. So that through whatever trial or tribulation, no matter how bad it is that gets thrown at you, you shine through it. And you teach these people how to stay focused on God. Even though that trial and that tribulation was so bad. This is what will make you stand out. This is what will make you that city on a hill. This is what makes you the light in the midst of the darkness. This is what will convict people's hearts. This is the testimony that you will live. And this is what will convict people's hearts and make them realize this person has something I don't. And they're going to go seeking, and guess what they're going to find? Jesus Christ, their Lord and Savior. The one who died for their sins and wants and desires for nobody to perish, but for everybody to come to an understanding of His truths and His finished work on that cross. When David came to the 200 men, he had been too exhausted to go with... When David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to go with him and had been left at the Wadi Besor. So when David came back to these men that were too tired to battle because they got too caught up in their own mental battle of crying too much. They got too worn out because of their crying and the battle inside of their mind, that they fell for the trap, so they couldn't go and fight the real battle. They didn't have the energy or the strength to cross that little river because they were too worn out. So they came out to meet him and to meet the troops with him. When David approached the men, he greeted them. But all the corrupt and worthless men among those who had gone with David argued. Now, why were these men corrupt and ruthless. Let's see, because they can't love the way that they are supposed to be loved, the way that they desire to be loved. They can't love their neighbor the way that traveler loved the man that had gotten robbed in that New Testament story that Jesus had told. They couldn't love more than they loved themselves, which is the way that God asks us to be. God asks us, love others the way you were loved. Forgive us of our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. But all the corrupt and worthless men among those who had gone with David argued, because they didn't go with us, we will not give any of the plunder we recovered to them, except for each man's wife and children. They may take them and go. So these men wanted to hold from these other men because they didn't do as much work and they got too caught up in the battle and they didn't go and fight the fight. So they got worn out and fell. So this is why these men were called evil and worthless, wicked men, because of their mindset. Their mindset wasn't God's mindset. Their mindset was the devil's mindset, was greed, was pride, was self-righteousness, thinking that they were better than these other people because of what they were able to accomplish and because they were able to cross that river and go and fight. But David said, my brothers, you must not do this with what the Lord has given us. Why? Because the Lord has given it to them. What does David go on to say? But David said, my brothers, you must not do this with what the Lord has given us. He protected us and handed over to us the raiders who came against us. Who can agree to your proposal? The share of the one who goes into battle is to be the same as the share of the one who remains with the supplies. They will share equally. And it has been so from that day forward. David established this policy as a law and an ordinance for Israel, and it still continues today. When David came to Ziklag, now pay attention to David's mindset in that situation. David's mindset was the way God thinks, while these men's mindset was the way the devil thinks, thinking about just themselves. So when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, here is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. He sent gifts to those in Bethel, in Ramoth of the Negev, and in Jatir, to those in Aroer, in Sifmoth, and in Estemoa, to those in Rakau, in the towns of the Jerahmeelites, and in the towns of the Kenites, to those in Hormah, in Borashan, and in Athak, to those in Hebron, and to those in all the places where David and his men had roamed. Chapter 31. The Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him. Again, the Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me. But his armor-bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. So on that day Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news in the temples of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. When the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their brave men set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned the bodies there. Afterward, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh and fasted 7 days.